Hello everyone, thank you for joining us for the third webinar of Detecting and Defending Against Cyber Threats, a short course presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward and I'll MC this webinar, and your mentor is Georg Thomas, who I'll ask you to welcome shortly. Before we begin, the usual housekeeping. We encourage questions and the use of chat during our webinars, and we ask that you direct all questions relevant to course content to the Q&A section, and all administration type questions, dates, times, resource availability, and all those sorts of things to the support team in chat. You can chat with panelists only, which is staff, or to your fellow students as well. And you can make that choice by toggling through the drop-down box once you've opened the chat log. As we're all constantly saying, there are very experienced attendees who have great insights that usually augment what we're delivering. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar, or if a question is particularly relevant, I'll jump in during George's discussion. And just a quick note, next week along the, I think just Eastern Seaboard excluding Queensland, there will be daylight savings changes. So check your local guides and make sure you don't get caught out. As usual, Hannah and Rebecca are here in support for IT Masters, and thank you again. Hannah is also responsible for the course page, which is where you'll find the other materials needed for this course, links to readings, discussions, forums, and quizzes. The forums are looking really good for this course. Heaps of interesting threads in there. I had a quick gander today and it was really nice. So if you haven't had a chance to go to do it yet, go and have a look. There's some cool stuff in there. Thanks everyone who's already been contributing to it as well. It's really, I think, one of the great advantages of these courses is the forums. Also in the general course forum, I added some info about an opportunity for what is essentially a free postgraduate award for Australian citizens. So I highly recommend you check that one out. Please, everyone, welcome back Dr. George. Hello, George. It's good to be with you again. What news in security land since we last spoke, and what have you got in store for us?
Hey guys, thank you. You can hear me, right? Hope so.
Yep, gotcha.
Cool. Yeah, I'm having some, I guess, camera difficulties, so I tried to do that, turn it on, but I just see darkness. So I am here. But anyway, yeah, welcome to week 3. And today we are going to cover off some, I guess we're going to cover off detection, or the detect part of the course. So last week we talked about sort of defense, and I thought that, and what's interesting is from detect, I know we talked about active and passive defense, and active defense really does encompass detection, but I thought it was significant enough that it warranted its own session. So that's kind of where we're going today. We're going to talk about those detective sort of detection methods and controls. And so just to kind of cover the 3 sort of topics we're going to cover today, we're going to cover detective controls. We're going to then, and those are those ones that are I guess, really focused around, detecting anomalous behavior and threats, I guess in a almost more automated fashion, but we'll then talk about logging and SIEM, because I thought that warranted its own little section. And then finally, we'll have a little bit of a chat on threat hunting. One thing that I did, as I just realized there's a bullet that I did miss, is that as promised, we are going to do a little bit of a demonstration today, just to kind of round things out and help, connect the dots together. And so moving on. So detective controls. So these are other controls that I guess are used, yes, as part of this sort of active defense method, but effectively to identify when there is, things like anomalous behavior and potential malicious behavior. And I guess to start with, and I know we did cover off a little bit of this last week, but I guess one of the controls that's been around for quite a long time is intrusion detection. So something like, you may be familiar with a platform called Snort. It's a very, I guess, fairly well-known, probably well-adopted platform that's been around for a number of years. It's open source. It's free. You can download it from, I think it's snort.org. I kind of a little pink pig with a very big snout. And it basically works. And sorry, I know that this is very, I guess, sort of high level and possibly a little bit not deep enough, but basically what it does is it is used to, you know, I guess, analyze network traffic. And so the way it works is that what they call like a span port or a mirror port is configured on a switch stack. And as the traffic flows past, Snort will, I guess, effectively sniff that traffic and look for sort of behaviors that may, you know, be potentially malicious. And that's against things like, you know, signature databases and rules and so forth. In an IDS, nothing actually happens aside from that sort of monitoring capability. And then that one step further is to move down into the IPS. And sorry if, you know, a lot of you are already familiar with this. As I said, I tend to cover off a little bit of this theory to start with, and then we'll kind of get into a bit more of a sort of demo. And so with the IPS, it's a very similar concept, except in this instance, the system sits in line. So if it does identify something, it does have the ability to actually block that, that traffic. So those are the sort of two IDS sort of IPSs at a very high level. Moving on to, you know, the kind of more recent technologies. Oh, and sorry, and the IPS capabilities and IDS are built into a lot of sort of firewalls these days. So, and I do actually have an ASA sitting next to me, but in my move, because I can't remember if I mentioned, but I've moved house in the last week. It's had a little bit of a meltdown. So, you know, a lot of these firewalls now, like, you know, Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet, you know, you name it, Checkpoint, will have a built-in IPS capability. And so the next thing to talk about is things like advanced endpoint threat detection. And so I know that in some of the forums, I think someone may have, or at some point someone mentioned something about, like, you know, next gen sort of AV and next gen sort of endpoint technologies. And really what we've got here is that sort of advanced endpoint threat detection. And there's platforms out there that, you know, have the ability to identify, you know, detect, once again, anomalous or malicious behavior on endpoints. And, you know, this is really valuable because with these other systems, a good example is, you know, with IDSs, you kind of have to place sensors all over the place to try and capture as much of the network as you can. I mean, obviously, as a primary point, you're going to put that behind or, you know, at your edge. But once, you know, if a threat actor is in, you know, some other way, or, you know, if it's an insider, it can be really hard if it doesn't go through that point. So where advanced endpoint threat detection is useful is it's deployed across your entire, I guess, environment, and it can, you know, detect things at the endpoint level. And so, you know, things like lateral movement and you know, process spawns that are, you know, unusual and things like that can be detected using these sort of, you know, advanced endpoint threat detection tools. And a lot of them will have additional capabilities like advanced, I haven't written it down here, but like advanced EDR, which is advanced endpoint detection and response, where it starts to give you things like forensic capabilities. And this is where we're starting to talk, like, you know, the sort of, you know, the Carbon Blacks and CrowdStrikes of the world, and those sorts of platforms that give you those sort of capabilities. And quite often, a lot of, and I'm about to talk about SOC and MSSPs. But, you know, a lot of those type of organizations will pull data from these sources. So I guess these technologies are great, obviously very useful, but I think, as I alluded to last week with active defense, it's really useful to have eyes on glass and someone sort of looking and actively reviewing as things are happening. And so this is where, you know, your SOC, so your Security Operations Center, and your Managed Security Services providers, so your SOC and MSSPs, come into play. And, you know, I think someone may have asked the question in week one about at what point, you know, is it worth bringing in-house capabilities versus, you know, sort of outsourcing. And, you know, that's a very, very complex question. Probably one that I stumbled over a little bit because it depends on the situation and lots of things like, you know, budgeting and capability requirements, and whether it requires someone to be able to remediate 24/7 and respond, and the sort of costs associated with that. And so some organizations will build out their security operations center internally. Some will outsource to a managed security services provider, but in pretty much every case, they will then rely on feeds coming from these IDSs, IPSs, advanced endpoint threat systems, and those sort of systems, as well as things that might fall into, and I know the next sort of slide is talking about SIEM, but your log sources and things like that. And then finally, you've got that sort of that digital forensics sort of area where here we're talking about being able to look at the environment, being able to capture things like evidence and indicators of compromise, having those preserved, potentially using those for law enforcement purposes. And I guess one of the key things here is having all this information really helps with that, which kind of brings me on to my next point, which is around logging and SIEM. And so if we think all the way back to even week one, and talking about those very common sort of threats that are around at the moment, when I look at incident response, and when I respond to an incident, or when I have responded to an incident, the first port of call is generally logging. And so it's as I sort of put here in the bullet point one, it's a critical component of detection, but it's also a critical component of investigation. And so logging, and when I say logging, we're talking about like event logs. So Windows event log. I mean, like there's multiple sources, but off the top of my head, Windows event logs, Office 365 logs, firewall logs, network sort of switch logs, administrative logs. So when people are logging into devices, authentication logs. I mean, the list is almost endless. But the more logs that you can bring in to a centralized place, and there's a reason for this, the better prepared you will be. And so one of the key things around the concept of SIEM, so security information and event management, is bringing all those logs together. And so aggregating those logs into one central repository where they are able to be protected, and I'll get into that in a sec, and then correlated. So, if something happens in one part of the network, and that might be, okay, well, there's like a piece of malware popped up, but then something else happens elsewhere, maybe that indicates lateral movement. So being able to correlate those logs because they're in one place is very, very helpful. On the topic of protection of logs, I only probably a month ago, someone asked me about, what do I need a SIEM? At the end of the day, it's a business decision whether, a SIEM goes in, and obviously a budgetary decision and so forth. But my explanation of it was based once again on some experience around incident response, where a threat actor had been able to brute force a remote desktop server. They got in, they ransomware the machine. They obviously held the company's data to ransom. But what they did before, before they did that and made themselves known, was they went through the Windows event logs of that machine and deleted everything that was, from when they basically would have brute forced the hell out of the machine to the point that they had, basically said, all right, well, we've done everything now, here's the ransom. In which case it was quite difficult from at least that machine to be able to identify a lot of information about, where the threats were coming from and so forth. In that instance, we had to then rely on the firewall logs to try and get, and Active Directory logs as if there's anything in there. But it sort of crippled the ability to investigate too deeply in that environment, and it makes it more difficult when it's a cloud environment and you don't have access to the sort of underlying disk infrastructure to try and recover things that way. So this is where basically taking those logs, shipping them off to a separate centralized platform, having them protected, it really becomes beneficial. And I guess the other, and so one thing to also note is that with a lot of systems by default, and I'm going to do a flick forward and then a back, is that a lot of log files a lot of logging is not enabled by default. So there is some logging, but it's usually very, very high level. In this instance, Windows Firewall logs are pretty much not configured. As you can see, the log files folders there is empty. DNS logs, they're probably one of the log sources. If you're going to do anything, log DNS requests, really useful because, any calls to potentially malicious servers and so forth from within your environment will get logged to DNS. So really, really helpful. Also disabled by default. I know in many systems, for Windows anyway, Active Directory environment, it's actually debug logging where you turn on DNS, and I think I probably will have a quick show of that in the virtual environment in a minute. The last thing I probably want to talk about in this space is PCAPs, so packet captures. Now, once again, like logging, PCAPs are really useful. I guess one of the challenges with PCAPs is, some people consider them to be a little bit extreme. They're quite resource intensive in that they use a lot of storage, typically, depending on how busy the environment is. And I think my advice would be to keep as many, to capture PCAPs and to keep them for as long as you can, because sometimes, and if we look at, the Mandiant report, going back a few years now, where they talked about dwell time, which is the amount of time it took from when a threat actor was able to infiltrate an environment to the time that they were detected. And yeah, that's, that's been decreasing in time, but if we think back in about 3 or 4 years, that was around the 500 days, and then it went down to like high 100 days, and then down to like 99 days, and so forth. But the longer that you've got those PCAPs, which are the captures of the network information that have gone through the network and through the switches and so forth, the more likely the better the outcome of the investigation is likely to be. And I am going to kind of go through a little bit of this PCAP stuff in a minute. Yeah, so anyway, moving on.
But just before you do, George, fair bit of feedback in the chat about people missing your lovely face. So wondering if it's worth tinkering around and having a bit of an intermission.
Yeah, do you know where I'm scared to pull a USB cable out because it's going to make everything kind of... I'll try it. Let's see what happens.
Give it a crack. In the meantime, I'll probably start plugging the subject that this is part of, just so you can have a play, and don't worry, I'll cover for a couple of minutes. This is part of the subject ITE 534, which is called... here we go.
Cyber warfare and terrorism.
Exactly. It's not so much part of it, but George teaches it, and you'll be talking a lot about this, wouldn't you, George? Throughout
would be. What is going on with this
camera? For those that are just missing George's face, good luck. For those that are slightly hearing impaired, terribly sorry for the inconvenience. When we do these recordings, we put them through a tool called Video Log. Video Hop, and that is a really good tool for, I guess, transcribing it accurately. Sometimes if you run it through some other tools, it's not very good. The transcription service that Video Hop provides is actually really good. So I'm really sorry, and if we can't fix it up and get the mouth to make it easy to focus and interpret, we'll have the recording available soon. How'd you go, George?
You just see black, right?
Yeah, just black.
That is weird. I've been using video all day, so I'm not sure why it's suddenly... you know what I could do, this might go a bit weird, is I have another camera on my laptop lid, so watch my machine go crazy. I have 3 screens up.
While you're mucking around with that, I've had quite a few questions about the ADF Cyber Gap program, which is what I was talking about in the introduction. I might have a bit of a chat about that at the end if everyone's keen. Oh, we can see you. Hello.
Yeah, different
Looking
camera.
lovely.
Yeah.
And I might even just cut a little video as well after today. and chuck that on the course page and probably on the website somewhere, just to give a bit of information and some frequently asked questions. We'll see. We'll see what everyone thinks. See if it'll be useful. Anyway, thanks heaps, George, for getting that.
Yeah, let's see what happens here. You know, I struggle with 2 screens. Let's see how 3 goes, especially in the middle. Like, and I've got, yeah. Anyway, let's carry on. And I can't see my controls anymore. So,
oh no.
Yeah.
Just let us know if you need anything.
Give me a second. I'm just gonna. Sorry, I'm just gonna move this over. Hopefully, no sparks or anything like that. There we go. Okay, that should work. All right. So, threat hunting. So I guess if you consider all of those things, so all those detection controls, RDS, IPS, Advanced Endpoint Threat Detection, SIEM, and mind you, when I talked about SIEM, as I said, you know, there's all these different log sources, but also things like, you know, your directories and having those imported to the point where, you know, you can detect when, you know, someone's been given privileged access rights, or when there's a new account and who created it, and that all that sort of stuff is really, really helpful in terms of this next point, which is threat hunting. And so the concept around threat hunting, and I was, I guess, introduced to this back in, oh God, I can't remember. It's probably the 20 somethings, maybe 2012, 2013. Was the whole concept around, and I did the SANS, Sec 511. I found the book. The SANS course, which was continuous monitoring and security operations, which was really about threat hunting and running a SOC. Really, really interesting. I know some people are thinking, oh, SANS courses, God, they're expensive. And yeah, they are, but they really are. But the company that I was working at the time became like one of the teaching centers. So they had a spare set of books. So yeah, for me. So it did that, great, want to capture the flag. But what I was going to say is the whole concept was that you assume that you're compromised. And, you know, if you kind of go back to it's not, you know, if but when, yeah, okay, maybe, you know, it's quite plausible that a compromise has happened. But the intent is to then go hunting, you know, hunting for whether a threat actor is already in the environment. And to do that, the key thing is to look for indicators of compromise. And to do that, you need to review those sort of you know, logs and controls that we talked about earlier. And so when I think about things like the business email compromise, and I know that Microsoft have a nice little, if anyone uses Office 365, in the Security and Compliance Center, which by the way is so good compared to what it used to be. Like, it's fantastic. You know, even something as simple as, you know, emails that are automatically forwarded external. There's a big metric for that. If it's anything above 0, it's definitely worth looking further and perhaps running, like, you know, or doing an audit on forwarding rules, because, you know, threat actors commonly forward email to themselves externally. So things like that, you know, so forwarding rules, especially external, well, I recommend that it's just disabled if there's no need for it. And things like unusual account creations, talking about DNS before, things like, you know, high entropy domains, you know, lots of failed domain lookups, those sorts of things are part of, you know, that sort of threat hunting style exercise. So, as I said, I like to split half and half, and I think we're coming up to about halfway for the hour. So what we're going to do is, we're going to go this demo thing. Now, as I said, I had a bit of a problem with my ASA, so, and my snort. So I do have some PCAPs I've prepared earlier, and what we're going to do today is I am going to first go for a bit of a walk through some of the logging settings. Then I'm going to go for a bit of a walk through, you know, looking at PCAP files and maybe carving out some, you know, some files out of the PCAPs, and then seeing if they're malicious. I mean, you could probably guess the answer to that, but, you know, just humor me. And then after that, we have a guest today, who will be going through a SIEM demonstration. And I will introduce him afterwards. But yeah, you're not gonna have to just listen to me for the next half an hour. So I thought I'd mix it up a bit. So anyway, let us do that. Where is my browser? I can't see anything. All right, so on to VMware. By the way, this is my local environment. I do not recommend you use root. Okay. So probably familiar with this little guy from last week. All right. Cool. So a couple of things. All right, we've got DNS logging in here, but I guess for anyone that uses Microsoft DNS for their, if they use Active Directory, I thought I'd just quickly show this. So within DNS Manager and then right-click Properties, this debug logging thing is really, really useful. So being able to, capture those queries and the details into this log file, and then what we're doing in this instance, and there's a point to this, which isn't going to be in the next bit, is that those log files are then, or this particular log file is then pushed up to a SIEM. So there is actually a SIEM in this environment. I can't see my icons, sorry. Likewise, I've enabled some other bits and pieces in here. So when looking at the Windows firewall, which typically has everything turned off. If I can remember where it is, it's not in there. Okay, yeah. So within here, same thing. So enabled logging, because these by default, as you probably saw in the screenshot before, are typically off. So this pfirewall.log and this dns.log, as well as the event logs from this system, are all being pushed up to a SIEM. So that's the first thing. What I actually did earlier was, I could probably do it again, just for fun. Probably remember this guy from last week. And sorry, I keep looking around the screen because I've got it covered. And you might be familiar with the ecar file. It's basically the ecar file is a file that's used to test, I guess, sort of, it returns true for malware, even though it is benign. But let's say hypothetically here, I run my ecar job. So I'm just going to download that. So I'm downloading that back to the first server. So where did I put it? Temp? Yeah, temp. So sorry, make use of the temp files. So if we go to temp, we could see it there. And also we talked about high entropy domains before. Sorry. And this is a high entropy domain. This is obviously a dodgy one that's not going to do anything, but high entropy domains, so all this garbage are used quite commonly. So we'll just run a job that we'll call a HTTP. Okay, cool. So we go back to here. We've got this malware that's sitting there. Okay. So what I actually did earlier was, in fact, what I'm going to do, I am going to delete it, right? Because all I wanted to do was copy it across the network. Using something like Wireshark, for anyone that has or has used that before. Wireshark is used to do packet capture. It's a really good troubleshooting tool. And yeah, sorry, I should have been running that. when you think about like, you know, IDS and so forth, and we're talking about capturing PCAPs, you could save those PCAPs out into PCAP files. So this is a copy of all the sort of network communications that had happened. And sorry, this is one I prepared earlier. So you can see, like, even the other day, there was my malware test file. And I think I copied that eCar file up earlier. So what you could do is, if you have access to the PCAPs, you can actually carve out the files. So using something like export objects, and I just realized that the HTTP thing I just did won't work because it was HTTPS, and you need to, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the concept of SSL decrypt, but basically when you download something over HTTPS, it's obviously encrypted. It will also mean it's encrypted in the PCAP. So we would have had to, I would have had to have configured SSL decrypt. So, I mean, we can obviously go through here and find it up there. So TLS 1.2, that was probably it. But we won't be able to see any detail within it. Where is it? Could be here all day. No. Anyway. So what we'll do is, yeah, so we'll skip over that, and we'll just go to exporting an object. So let's say you got a PCAP file, and I know there was one copy in the file system. Wireshark will show you files that are contained within the PCAP, and what you can do is you can carve the file out. So I'm just going to carve the file out and pop it into my favorite place in the world, temp, save. All right, so you'll see now that the eCar file is right there. So let's say I want to see if that's malicious. So I've mapped back here. So there's my eCar file. Where is PowerShell? So where is it? Am I blind? Oh, wrong drive. All right. Okay. Right. So we have this eCar file here. So you can upload the whole file, but that might be a bit of a virus detection problem. Apparently I have a virus detection problem anyway. So 1 second. Oh yeah. Don't do this.
Sound advice.
Yeah. So, okay. So we take the hash. Like I said, you could upload the file. I opened VirusTotal up earlier. Go search, paste the hash, hit enter, and lo and behold, detected as malicious. So, you know, that's kind of I mean, that was a very, very quick example of how one might do that. If they have a PCAP, you can carve out the executables or the, you know, something in there, or and then throw it up into, you know, get the hash or get the file, throw it up into VirusTotal. And VirusTotal is very, very useful. I use it quite frequently, and it will, you know, return a result. So unless it's never seen it before, so 0 day I might struggle a bit with. But anyway, so that is the very quick PCAP carving exercise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand this over to my other demo half here, Matthew Moore. So Matthew is what are you? Like a senior engineer slash Splunk guru. I'm going to call you Splunk guru, sorry, I like it. And Matthew has kindly offered to do a demo of Splunk, so SIEM environment with, I think, ES. So I actually, I spun it up a couple of days ago, and I thought, you know, it'd be nice to see a different face, and Splunk, and Matthew could probably explain it a lot better than I can. So feel free to introduce yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. George. So As George said, my name is Matt. I am a Splunk engineer. I've been Splunking for about 5 years, and we've set up a demo environment. And I'm just going to say a quick prayer to the demo gods and make sure that I can share my screen okay. So what I'm going to do is over the next few minutes, going to take you through log aggregation generally, and Splunk is a log aggregation platform. I could see in the chat window, quite a few of you are familiar with log aggregation, and there's a few platforms out there. Obviously, I'm prejudiced, and I use Splunk for my log aggregation at home as well as at work. So I'm going to go through core concepts, why we're going to, or why it's important to keep track of logs and what we can use them for. Then shift into more of a proactive visibility into what's going on, what we can get out of these logs, what kind of indications of compromise, what kind of visibility into our environment we can get. And then shift into Splunk as a SIEM. Again, there's a lot of SIEMs out there. I'm prejudiced, and this is what I use. However, I'm going to use this tool to show you what a SIEM is capable of when you're using it in a threat investigation scenario.
I feel like just for the sake of being fair, I mean, Logarithm, QRadar, ArcSight, Greylog, Alien Vault, obviously Splunk.
There are a lot out there, all with their merits. I'm going to try and remain as neutral as possible while presenting this. Obviously, I struggle.
No, don't bother. Tell us what you really think, and then we'll figure out how to make it fair.
Maybe over a beer at some point.
Excellent.
So, just starting from first principles, I know we've got people from all walks of life and all levels of experience in the call in the webinar this afternoon. So for those of you who know logs, I do apologize for what we're about to go through. I spent a good 15 years or so in support and implementation looking at logs, and I kind of want to gouge my eyes out when I want to see them, or when I see them. But there is a lot of really useful information in there. Everything that happens within your environment, everything that happens in your network, every time someone logs into your cloud environment, moves a file, accesses something, or makes a change, has the capability of being logged out somewhere. The reason it's important to have that kind of trace is at the moment, and a lot of people disagree on the figures for this, but the average dwell time, the average time between a breach occurring and someone actually noticing is between 50 and, according to IBM, 197 days. So there's a lot of scope, or a lot of disagreement on the dwell time there. But being able to trace that back through, find out what's been done, who patient zero was, how they got in, and going through that whole forensics process does mean you need to have some record of the things that have been happening on your network. The other reason it's important is a lot of tools have their own inbuilt dashboarding, inbuilt alerting. So a lot of good IDS, IPS systems like Palo Alto or some of the Cisco devices have their own reporting modules, and I'll give you a fragmented sort of keyhole insights into that part of the world. Some user behavior analytics or ML-based detection products like Darktrace, for example, have that little keyhole lens into it. Same for your cloud products, Azure, AWS, etc. But you end up with this swivel chair effect. So you're trying to piece together these processes, these journeys that people have taken through your environment to get where they are. And you're constantly having to rehome between the individual points. So the advantage of having a central log aggregation strategy, whether it's putting it all on a server and using Notepad++ to go through it, or having something like Splunk or other log aggregation platforms, is you've got that single source of truth. You've got something that's slightly divorced from the rest of your environment, so that you can protect this separately, meaning that if someone does have their way with your systems, they can't go and edit the logs to try and hide what's happened. And you've got that ability to sort of go in without having to pivot between a dozen different tools and look at what's happening. Now, the reason I first got into Splunk, and I was into Splunk before I started working here, which was really lucky from my perspective, is working back in support and implementation. The way my workflow would go is something happens, in this case, perhaps a breach. In my case, it was usually a phone system falling over. You have to RDP onto a range of servers, SSH and instant routers, collect the logs, put them in a Notepad++, and then trace the journey. Having all of that in one platform here, kind of like a magical Notepad++ for a start, means that you don't have to do that. Everything is already waiting for you there, and you can start piecing together the last few days of activity if you've noticed something quickly, or the last few months if you've got to hit the ground running. We've just noticed a bad breach that's been around for a while, and there are a few companies around Melbourne at the moment who have noticed that recently and have hit the news. So in this kind of event, or in this kind of scenario, we can actually go through and look at the logs manually the way we would do in the old days. We can see a range of good information coming through here. We can see Oracle authentications. We can see firewall activity on George's server. We can see people interacting with cloud devices, sending and receiving emails, and start getting a sort of a lay of the land. We can also start zooming in on that. So ITMS VR1 is a demo environment that George put together for the IT Masters course. Now, the reason behind platforms like this is being able to, A, zoom quickly into the area of logging that you want to actually interact with. So in this case, we've got a range of different things from that machine. We've got your Windows event logs, security events, application events, system events such as restarts, insertion of USB keys, patches, stuff like that. We've got his DNS logs, which contain a wealth of information in their own rights, and of course Windows firewall events. Now you can see Windows Firewall currently dominates what's going on, and we can take us in closer to one of these ones and see what kind of information we get. The information on whether it is actually an attack or an IDS event, whether the packet was allowed, what the source and destination was, and we can use that to sort of inform what's been happening on the environment. But where things from this environment specifically get interesting is when we start looking at those DNS logs. So when we look into those DNS logs, I know for a fact we've got some interesting activity because George has been connecting to some very interesting domain names with a lot of entropy. And when we start looking into these, we can see these domain names aren't ones that we would generally buy if we were going to try and advertise a website. This is important because high entropy algorithmically generated domain names like these are often used by bad actors as a temporary placeholder in order to send data out to, or as a way of sending data out in its own right, so encoding data as a fake DNS query and sending it out to a DNS server that they actually own, and essentially send data out over your DNS streams. So we can see we do have some activity like that here. And again, we could go through the old-fashioned way and start reading through the logs and piecing this together manually, which is not the most pleasant way of doing it. Or we can use the other half of a log aggregation tool, which is being able to parse and interpret the logs at search time and start putting together either correlations or even just basic statistical analysis on top of that. So I might want to see what my top queries are from George's server there, just by passing it through the top query. And that gets me from having to look manually through the log lines to seeing what kind of things are coming through. So you can see this really nasty domain name up here and another slightly dodgy one down there. So interesting. Now I could take you through logs all night and I could end up putting a few of you asleep in the process. So I'm going to pivot away from this and show you why once you've got this kind of data in one place, it's handy to use something like a SIEM to be able to provide real-time and historical intelligence on top of that and put a no worries, Stuart. I do have the chat messages coming up, and if I can help someone by putting them to sleep, that's definitely going to be a weight off my mind. So we've got the logs coming in. We've got data coming in from your IDS, IPS systems. We've got email logs coming in. We've got all your authentication logs from your IAM devices. What are we going to do with that? Well, instead of going through it manually, we can start putting together searches like the one you just saw, to be able to pull the information out proactively and monitor that data coming in. And I'll take you through I'm going to take you through a few high-level dashboards that show some of the lenses we can put on this data. These are all obviously security dashboards. They don't necessarily have to be, but this is what we're talking about tonight, so it's what we're going to have a look at. So looking at George's DNS activity, along with some DNS activity from some other devices, so this isn't all him, we've got a range of information. So this machine's been up for a few days. We can see the number of DNS messages has dropped down by about 254 messages. And we can actually see that in our timeline. We had a bit of a drop down earlier today when stopped experimenting with DNS and stopped pushing quite so much through. We have, however, got a massive increase in errors. Could be indicative of something. I'm not sure, but it's certainly interesting it sticks out. And also a rapid drop in the number of queries. Interestingly, what I can see here is for high entropy domain queries, so those things that might indicate an algorithmically generated domain used by a bad actor, or unusual data sent out by 9 times out of 10 Sophos, which I saw mentioned earlier, but it uses DNS to phone home. The other 1 time out of 10, it's someone who's got command and control of one of your systems and is sending your precious IP out over DNS. But we can see for the domains we're seeing, a couple of them have high entropy, and they are the exact dodgy ones we saw stick out like a sore thumb earlier. We can also see some handy information if I was coming back forensically and trying to work out what's going on. I can see what the top queries were. Again, a high entropy query was coming up a lot more than the others, and also which queries we're getting per domain. So this is a good way of seeing which domains have had a lot of unique activity against them and potentially have been traversed programmatically or by a very, very enthusiastic user. Now, moving quickly through these, so dashboard tour is not the most fun to go through either, but just to show you some of the things you can do with this. HTTP category analysis. Now, this is interesting because I noticed when setting up SIEMs for a couple of companies up in Queensland, we got some unusual anomalies. So forgetting the key indicators across the top, we have this scatter graph down here that shows on the x-axis the number of times particular categories have turned up, and on the y-axis the distinct count of categories, so the number of distinct websites for those categories. So this one's been highly skewed, and this is not what it looks like in a normal scenario. On the left-hand side, we can see proxy avoidance, which is interesting. People are using a lot of distinct proxy avoidance strategies there, or sites. We can see religion, violence, user-defined, a lot of interesting stuff. But what's sticking out like a sore thumb here is this one it's unknown for a start, so that's unusual. There's been a huge number of hits to it, and 15 distinct sources as well. So 15 computers within, presumably my network, have reached out to an undefined unknown category, possibly one of those algorithmically generated domains we were looking at earlier, and it's just blown the others away, just bringing our attention to it. Now, this is where I point out, this is not from my browser history. This is actually from some data within the demo environment, but I can say this is very much what it looks like, even if you're in a corporate environment. Interestingly, a large customer I was working with up in, I think it was Queensland about 5 years ago, when looking at their entire corporate category list, the second most common category was internet dating. So you end up seeing some interesting things out there. Again, not related to our current threat, although this might be. Moving forwards, to be able to bring in information from things like your IDS and IPS devices, your firewalls, your dark traces, for example. Having a dashboard like this, great way of just seeing a high-level state of the nation to see what kind of threat sources you're seeing, where it's occurring, how it's occurred during your throughout your network, what your distinct source and destination landscape looks like, and getting that sort of context to be able to inform what's going on throughout your environment there. Now, there are 2 more areas I'd like to bring attention to. There are a lot of dashboards available here, which are used as interactive tools to basically follow your nose and see what's going on when something happens. But I'm just going to go through 2 more because dashboards suffer from, I guess, one fatal flaw. You have to look at them. You're not going to have eyes on glass, people staring at 150 different dashboards 24/7. It's just not feasible, and humans get bored, lose attention, stare away from the screen, or get distracted by their phone. So we're going to move on from dashboards and look at automated threat detection for emergent behavior, correlated IOCs across different threat domains, and some interesting stuff there. But 2 I want to bring your attention to now. Firstly, Vulnerability Center. If you're using vulnerability scanners like Tenable Nessus, which is fantastic, or Qualys, which effectively do, probably stretching the term here, but effectively do automated pen testing to see if you've got vulnerabilities against your various machines, and let you know if there's something there you need to fix or need to look at. Now, the reason I'm bringing attention to this is I don't have any vulnerability data coming into this environment. At least not from George's environment. I do have some Nessus data from the demo environment itself, and we can see various vulnerabilities across the left-hand side. Well, what stuck out like a sore thumb when I started going through this is this guy here from the IT Masters demo environment. I'm going to click into that because I wasn't expecting to find it at all. So the interesting thing here is it's picked up the vulnerability, but not from a scanner. Bringing in the Windows event logs from George's device, it actually picked up the fact that there was an authentication policy change over the last few days as a potential vulnerability and something for us to go and look at. So really cool. I wasn't expecting to find that, but it's handy having things like that pulled to our attention from areas we might not have looked at if we were left to our own devices and start pouring through these things manually. The last thing before I go into a more exciting, perhaps more real-life threat hunting scenario is risk analytics. Now, the risk framework, again, there's a lot of ways of implementing it, and obviously a lot of different products that will provide this kind of functionality, but this is a really succinct and handy way of keeping track of what's happening against your system. If something unusual happens to a device, for example, a brute force behavior from one of your machines or to one of your machines, a malware outbreak or a particular malware signature that keeps returning, whenever that happens, you bump up the risk score on that device. At the end of the week or the end of the month or the end of the year, the ones with the most rapidly increasing threat scores are either undergoing a breach or a breach attempt or are getting a lot of attention from basically the rest of the world. So being able to look at these risk modifiers by looking at how that changes over time, and we can see how that kind of attention varies over time, but also which ones have had the most unusual activity occurring against them. So I can start concentrating on those and perhaps do some manual investigation on those machines, while also having an idea for my environment what the most active or most prevalent indications of compromise actually are, just to give us that context to better secure our environment, but also be able to follow our nose through this as well. Now for the fun stuff.
Just before we move on, sorry, Matt, we've got a couple questions, just a couple of quick ones. Are these dashboards custom, or have you custom configured, or are they default?
That's a really good question. So I wasn't going to go into the specifics of it too much, but seeing as you asked, Splunk's log aggregation platform, so Splunk Enterprise, provides the ability to create these dashboards, and there's a range of free applications available on Splunk base that provide SIEM functionality, additional dashboards, and so on and so forth. These specific ones are from Splunk's premium SIEM offering, Splunk Enterprise Security, which rides on top of the Splunk platform as an app in its own right, and these dashboards are included as part of it. Having said that, Splunk's Open Bonnet, it's not open source by any way, shape of the imagination, but it is Open Bonnet, and you can go and edit dashboards. For example, with this one here, I added the high entropy domain query myself, and you can put together very similar dashboards relatively quickly in the core Splunk offering as well. However, things like enterprise security means you get the whole platform with the correlations, the threat and risk framework, and obviously these dashboards out of the box.
Cool, thank you. And Jay's wondering whether the dashboards update in real time.
That's actually a good question too. Splunk's a real-time platform. You can have the dashboards update in real time. I usually take a more conservative approach of having a 1 or 5 minute refresh, purely because having the searches run in real time has extra load on the system. And if someone misses something by a couple of seconds because they're not staring at the dashboard, it's usually not too much of an issue. And to the minute or to the 5 minute interval for a lot of these, it's just as good.
Awesome. Thanks heaps. Let's keep going.
Yeah, no worries. All right, so this is usually what I show first. Most dashboards sit away in a quiet corner until something happens and you have to go and investigate. This is the 40,000 foot helicopter view, state of the nation, any other cliche you can think of, that sits up on your SOC wallboard and lets you know what's happening now. So this is comparing today with yesterday. So we can see we've got the sharp increase in notables across our endpoint, access domain, and networks, and a slight increase in threat. It also gives us how we're performing in our notable events. So we've got various notable events by urgency. Now that's a product of how severe the indication of compromise is, whether it's a brute force attempt or a rootkit installed on some machine. They're not going to have the same criticality. And also the importance of the device. If a rootkit gets installed on your CEO's laptop, you better run and do something about it, or there's going to be a lot of noise resulting. If it's a brute force attempt against your honeypot, that's not such a big deal. What we can see here is, and this is not something you usually see in a production environment if things are tuned and prioritized correctly, but we can see we've got a lot of critical notable events. That's not great. That means we should do something. Looking at our behavior over time, we can see we had this spike of network notable events. I know exactly what they are. They are those high entropy domain names that were coming through from George's environment earlier today. And we can also see, I actually quite love these, I love these two panels down the bottom. They don't look like much, but when you look at the patterns that start occurring, we can see the top notable events and the spark line showing which ones may have happened at the same time, indicating something may have occurred or something may have begun or ended at that time. And same with the top notable event sources, so the things that the IOCs have been detected against. And again, we can see that sort of vertical line, that pattern that's drawing out there, indicating that something happened around that time and they're probably related. Now, to try and spice things up a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the incident review panel. I could just click into the criticals here, but I'm just going to go over to the incident review panel instead and have a look at the various things that have been picked up. Now, this is where a SIEM excels. This doesn't just store the data, it doesn't just put it up in dashboards. It starts cross-correlating events from different domains. So if you've got various authentication schemes, so you might have people authenticating against AWS, Azure AD, local authentication against your on-prem Active Directory, it'll tie all of that together and give you unusual behavior for users across all of them. It'll look for indications of compromise across individual machines through your IDS, IPS, so on and so forth, and allow you to drill down into them to get context to actually start hunting through them. So looking down into this, again, we can see that anomaly, that big blob earlier today, which was unusual domain names. And as we start looking down through the notable events, we can see high entropy domain query is still occurring a little bit. But what I'm noticing here is we've got threat activity detected for an unusual IP address. Now, I say unusual, it's not really the right term. We've got threat feeds coming in from a number of sources into this environment for known compromised domains, known compromised IP addresses, dodgy processes, stuff like that. And we've noticed within our traffic logs, or at least one of our logs, something has tried to connect to that. So that indicates something bad. So I'm going to drill down into this and try and get some additional context. Now, what this has done is given us a range of things that have been detected alongside this notable event. We can see the destination, which is that dodgy IP address with a risk score against it. We've got a source, which is a local IP address, so it's a machine I'm probably responsible for that probably shouldn't be connecting to that, and options to go and compare them with other things, look at the history of the event and so on and so forth. Where things get cool, though, is we can take actions against them. So I might want to Google that IP address and see if anyone else has come across it. And surprise, surprise, it's part of the Alien Vault Open Threat Exchange, which is where we got the threat info from. And it's certainly a dodgy IP address, so I'm not going to connect to it. I could have pinged it or run traceroute against it or a few things. But what I'm interested in is why that source is connecting to it. So whose PC, laptop, or server is that? What else has it been doing? So I can pass it through to one of those dashboards that we were looking at earlier. I'm going to choose the Asset Investigator because I find that's a great place to start an investigation. See what else has been going on, what else that thing has been doing, and who owns it. So it is a known device. It's owned by Chris Gilbert, who used to be our Director of Sales Engineering. We know where it is. We've got some contextual information there. We can call them up and say, hey, have you been doing some unusual stuff? Or if it's someone who's just given notice, maybe not call them up and do some investigation first. We've also got these swim lanes here, which are editable, but these are fine for them looking at the moment. So we can see changes to that machine over time. I can drill down into them and see what those changes are. So people have been changing printer drivers, downloading cookies, doing a range of stuff. I've got the threat list activity, so we can see the IP Intel threat that we picked up. But what's sticking out to me, or standing out to me at the moment, is there's executable file activity. So there's some executables that have been picked up as being not quite kosher. I love that George brought up next generation endpoint detect and response software earlier today because this has been picked up through Carbon Black logs, and that's a great way of picking up on these things, but also a great source of info. Also saw someone mentioning Sysmon in the chat, which is a great way of picking this up as well. So I'm going to hurry through it because I believe I'm getting towards the end of my time here, but looking in detail at this, I can see that a couple of those, so calc.exe is running under Chris Gilbert's user app local temp directory, which is not something you'd expect. I mean, if someone's running calc under anything apart from Windows or potentially System32, I can't remember which one it is, that's not a good thing. So I could pass that through to someone else, raise it, so set up a notable event to detect that in the future, or let's go through our logs. Let's see exactly what's going on. So what this has done is, yeah, he has been on the computer for 20 hours. He clearly needs to get a break. What we've done here is open up a search containing those events so I can see what data it came from and get some context there as well. So scrolling down until I get to calc, we can see we've got a process GUID. That's an ID within the operating system of that process, the thing that ran, created, in this case created that file. And to find out what happened, we can start pivoting to a slightly different part of the investigation. We'll run a workflow action, find out what else that process did. We see you doing something dodgy, what else did you do? And when that opens up, we'll get a list of things that process did, and we should be able to trace it back to what originally opened it. So it wrote to calc.exe somewhere it shouldn't. It created the file, and okay, so the first thing that we can find related to that process GUID is someone using PDF Reader to open up a PDF report under temporary internet files content of Outlook. So it looks like someone had a slightly dodgy attachment that came through from their email. Now, as a slightly paranoid analyst at the moment, I'm now going to be worried if I'm going to have a breach on a whole bunch of different laptops, if I'm going to get a phone call from a whole bunch of different users that have their credentials compromised or something along those lines. So I'm going to take another pivot and go to the email threat investigator with the addresses star, but looking for that attachment to see if we've had anyone else receive that attachment, just to see if we're going to be spending the next fortnight tidying up people's machines. And a couple of things. Chris Gilbert, our Director of Sales Engineering at Buttercup Games, received one email, the only one, from a guy called Jose Dave at Buttercup Games. So someone's actually gone to the effort of purchasing a domain with very, very similar spelling and has sent it specifically to this guy. So it's safe to say it's a spear phishing attack. He really wanted to get into Chris Gilbert's machine, so we probably really want him not to. But at least I can put my hand on my heart and say no one else is potentially compromised. I don't have to spend the weekends going through this information, but I am going to add that MTA from their email client or email server to our threat intel feed, so it's picked up in future. I'm going to add the name to the threat feed and the sender domain as well, so that we can start tidying up the backdoor and get some proactive notifications if anyone connects to that or we hear anything from it. And then finally, because I'm a good security analyst and I've been taking notes and saving searches as I go through, I'm actually terrible at that, and this is where it really saves me. I'm going to come back to my notable event or incident management view, and I'm going to open up a new investigation down the bottom. A very uncreative name, and add what I've been doing. So look at my searches over the last 30 minutes, add the ones related to this investigation. So if this goes to legal or if it goes to HR, I can put my hand on my heart and say, yeah, I exercise due diligence. If it ends up in the news, we've got our bases covered, we know what we've done. Save that, and at this point, make a phone call to have that guy's machine re-imaged and potentially have a chat about why someone might be so interested in his data. Now, I realize we're getting close to the end of the session, so I'm going to head back to George and Guy at this point, but definitely welcome some questions later on. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. What I was going to say is what I was just thinking is, where's my share screen? Share screen. So sorry, this isn't a Splunk plug. I just happened to use Splunk. Given that it's in my environment, I've got a demo dev license. And one thing that I was going to say is talking about, that was very relevant. If we go back to the first session about, people breaking into terminal servers and then dropping ransomware on the machines. So I think I can answer a couple of questions. There's one in the chat that I saw that says, how do logs get into, log data get into Splunk? And so the way that, and I think there's multiple ways to do it, and I'm sure Matt can talk about those if anyone's got any specific questions, but the easiest way is the universal forwarder. And so I have an RDP server that I stood up, and I threw the universal forwarder onto it, and I forwarded it to my local Splunk instance, which you can do with any SIEM, obviously. But what was interesting is very, very quickly, and I mean within like a week, I started to get people hitting my RDP server and these brute force attacks. So I then obviously Splunked it and turned it into a little map. I think it might have been Matt that actually sent me the code to get the pretty map here. But you can see here that I've had like 806,000 attempts from an IP in France of people trying to hit my little RDP server running on my VM. So I know someone else made a comment about people running VMs at home. Yeah, I have quite a few running here. But
so George, we're just looking at a desktop at the moment.
Oh, did I not hit share? Oh, I shared the wrong one. Well, see, that's what happens when you have 3 screens. I can't even work out how to get my mouse down there. Come on, mouse. Where are you? Aha. Try again. Wait 1 second. Share. That's weird. Did that work?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So this is my my little RDP server with the data from Windows Event Security Log getting splunked, or going into SIEM. And what I could see here is where the IPs, using the IP location and geostats, I can see where these attempts are coming from. So if I where's the view? Anyway, if I just hover over it, I could see here that, and as you can see at the top, there's 3.7 million events. So that's definitely indicative of brute force. I mean, this was running over probably about 2 or 3 weeks. But you can see here that, from a French IP, there was 807,000 odd, from a German, 4,000. If you move over here to, Russia, 104,000, someone in Perth, probably just hit my server by accident. But, this kind of shows that, an RDP server stood up. Obviously, threat actors are actively looking for these servers, and then they found mine, and then they hit it. Now, I do have MFA on the machine, so cross fingers that had they guessed my password, which is, well, not likely, but possible, that then there would have been a second layer of defense. But yeah, this is an example of the kind of visibility that you can kind of bring out of that. And then to kind of add to that, and so how do I move this thing out of the way? I can then look at what the usernames were. So if you could see that, these are the usernames that were attempted against my little RDP server. There's, how many of them are there? 50,000 different usernames that were attempted. Like if I just pick, and even if I know there was some attacks on like hospitals and that. If you go further in, if I go to N, well, God, I'm still at B. It was like nurse and all sorts of stuff. So it's really useful to have this information captured, and I could see like what was actually happening. So yeah, just a little tidbit there. Anyway, cool.
Cool indeed. I wonder if there's cats become dogs now.
What?
My password from last week.
Oh, right. So that's it on the demo. I mean, that was pretty lengthy. So
no,
yeah,
fantastic.
Thanks again, Matt, for walking us through that.
Yeah, bloody good. All right, well, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session then. First of all, there's quite a few questions about, I guess, what your thoughts are on particular tools and programs and platforms and those sorts of things. And I reckon I'll just, in the interest of timeliness, dismiss those and say chuck them in the forums, because that's where we get like the really interesting insights into what people's different uses are. I think all of these are maybe questions, and it sort of depends on what you need and why you need it and those sorts of things. Just quickly, George, I briefly touched on your subject earlier, but of course I don't deliver it. I'm wondering if you might be able to talk us through, what sort of things we haven't had time to cover fully today, but would be covered further in the full subject.
Well, I mean, the full, so this sort of, I guess, 4 weeks is really a very kind of contained sort of subset of the subject. So, the subject does have like a couple of weeks that are purely focused on defense and detection and those sorts of things. Whereas the full subject covers, a lot more around, threat actors, state actors. I know we did talk a little bit about that, but it obviously goes into a lot more depth. The other thing that's in the sort of full subjects, we sort of touch a lot more on, sort of, legal, ethical, policy, government, those sorts of things. So it's this stuff is in there, but it's a lot broader. So there's a lot more that we sort of cover off in those sessions. So this is kind of like a bit of a sampler. Evidently, this is probably a lot more demos, I think, in this. And I still typically do some demonstrative stuff in the full subject, but the whole subject isn't purely technical, where this was probably a little bit more geared towards the, technical and audience in terms of what we're showing. A bit more in the tools and in the weeds, I think, in this one. Yeah,
cool. And as Stuart said, if you're interested in, really interested in this, want to do another short course on it, we did a cybersecurity and cyber warfare and terrorism short course a few years back. So that can augment this one as well. Let's go through some questions, and Matt, feel free to jump in. Maybe the two of you can sort of bounce off each other. It's been really great having multiple voices in. How much does Snort tax a network? David asks.
Well, once again, it depends. If it's in IDS mode, there should be very little noticeable impact at all, because it is simply just sniffing traffic, right? So it's I think if you're familiar with a sort of promiscuous mode term, but effectively all that's happening is the switch is forwarding all the packets over to Snort, and it's sitting off to the side. So there's no throttling or anything like that. It's just basically getting a copy of everything. So from the experience that I've had, it's been, and we have IDSs deployed as well as IPSs, but the IDS has made no noticeable difference that I can tell. So, and our infrastructure team, trust me, I'd hear about it. Haven't really noticed anything.
Cool, thank you. One for Matthew, from Nathan. Does forwarding all DNS traffic to your internally controlled DNS servers stop data exfiltration via that channel?
Just saw that one come up. That's a really good question. So long as the DNS traffic comes to your internally controlled DNS servers and stops there and nothing has to be redirected elsewhere, then yeah, absolutely. I could envisage a scenario where DNS traffic could need to go elsewhere for resolution, in which case that might not be a guaranteed way of stopping that. Love to know George's thoughts.
Sorry, what was that question again?
Does forwarding all DNS traffic to your internal DNS servers stop data exfil via DNS?
Does it stop it? Well, no, it depends, right? So I'm not sure it via DNS. That's a good question. I mean, I think once again, I mean, it depends on configuration, but I mean, I think that if you're forwarding it through your DNS server, which means that you obviously, I'm sorry if you just said that, I was looking at something else, but if you've blocked the ability for DNS to go out any other channel, then it's going to be difficult to exfiltrate through a DNS server in that fashion. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult. but I actually haven't tried to exfil over DNS with a local DNS server.
It'd be worth trying it. If the DNS, if the query can't be resolved locally and needs to be redirected somewhere else for resolution, I would imagine you could still get data out that way, I think.
Yeah, but typically you would configure your DNS forwarder on your DNS server to forward to specific DNS servers. So you would tell it to say, okay, well, if you can't resolve it locally, then forward it to, like, Cloudflare 1.1.1.1 or Google 8.8.8.8.8.4.4. So those are easy to remember, by the way. Yeah, I think it's probably something that would be a good practice to have.
Alrighty, let's have another question, maybe on a SIEM. Would there be tools out there that complement SIEMs, or should the question be what would complete a SIEM? This is from Rohit.
I don't mind quickly going through that one.
Great.
So it seems a great way of getting all of your information in one place so you can cross-correlate, detect IOCs, follow your nose through it, and perform investigations. What we found, at least obviously working at Splunk, what I've found a lot of people are moving towards is being able to respond to threats at machine speeds, moving away from having a security analyst look at a dashboard, find the threat source, go and clean it up manually, then go and update that ticket. So products that would complement a SIEM in that respect would be security orchestration and automated response tools. There's a number available. Splunk has one, obviously. Palo Alto has a good one as well. There's a number of other ones, which basically allows you to say, okay, we've detected this IOC either from a single source, such like IDS, IPS, or from a range of sources indicating a broader compromise. Execute this playbook against them. Maybe have a look at a particular attachment that came through an email, do a virus total lookup, run screenshot machine against a URL, make a decision, then push out a patch or reimage a device or something like that. So that absolutely complements the SIEM and allows you to react a lot more quickly to essentially script kiddies who don't type things out slowly at human speed anyway. Also the unsupervised machine learning tools on top of that. Someone mentioned Darktrace, and that does a degree of user behavior analytics as well. There are obviously Splunk has a user behavior and user and entity behavior analytics product too, which basically taps into your SIEM data and looks for unusual behavior within your users and your devices, such as changing their work hours, changing their lunch hours, using a USB key in a machine that generally doesn't use that. So that also complements SIEMs as well by using unsupervised algorithms to supplement your analyst skills.
Thank you. Ignacio asks, is the Splunk SIEM needed, is the app needed to be able to provide the demonstrated functions, or will the platform alone suffice?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the app, Enterprise Security, is a Splunk app built on top of Splunk. Theoretically, if you had time and patience, you could sit down and code it all up yourself. You could absolutely do that. In fact, before it existed, it got brought to our attention that people were using Splunk as a SIEM before that was even a twinkle in the eye of our developers. So the long story is you can basically put together a lot of this functionality, correlations, and dashboards yourself. The reason people generally don't is because there's a huge team of developers constantly updating that to keep up to date with threats as they occur and changes in the landscape. But small to medium enterprises and, of course, home users like myself, it's a different story. I've got my own dashboards running on top of the free Splunk platform, monitoring my home router and showing me the number of attempts from people in the Seychelles to get into my system. For some of the smaller companies I work with as well, they use some of the free SIEM apps like InfoSec and Splunk Security Essentials, which you can use to essentially take advantage of the open bonnet nature and put together a SIEM yourself as well. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but let me know if you need more detail.
Thanks. George, Roger asked a question asking about how you mentioned an example relating to SIEM and mentioned that unfortunately it was a cloud-based server, and wonders if there's some limitations in that scenario.
Yeah, so that was around forensics. So short answer is yes. Cloud-based infrastructure can be a little more complex in terms and limiting in terms of the forensic investigations that you can conduct. And so obviously with cloud, there's, you know, multiple flavors, right? So your IaaS, SaaS, PaaS, all the stuff that ends in, never mind. So basically with, you know, SaaS, you're obviously very limited to the tools that are available within the product itself. So if you think Office 365, you're reliant on those logs. Now, obviously, the good thing is with those type of platforms is even as a global admin, you can't trash the logs. So that's great. But if you're looking at a platform like IaaS, where you're basically given a Windows VM or a Linux VM or whatnot, the person that is the administrator of that system has full access to the log files and can effectively, and the file system, and can effectively delete whatever they want. Now, what that means is that recovery can be very difficult. And yes, there are things like snapshots and so forth, but typically they're going to be point in time. So, you know, if there's a destruction of information, it's not like you can run it will easily run a forensic tool that can like lift that off the disk somehow, because you simply do not have access to it. So that's where it's useful to forward that information to a separate system where that information that is completely separate. So, you know, not just copying it to another server that's, you know, that same user will probably have access to, that, you know, malicious user, but something separate where the logs can then be protected and then reviewed as needed. So I guess that's what I was getting at, is that, you know, data recovery and forensics is more difficult in cloud environment, as a rule of thumb.
Thanks. And Roger's asked another question. Do cloud providers like Azure, AWS, GCP provide cloud-based IPS and IDS?
Yes, they do. But you got to pay for it.
Yep.
So I know that Azure, for example, does have, well, I mean, pretty much everything that you would have on-prem is almost now available in cloud. So Azure has, like they have SIEM, I can't remember what it's called. I don't remember what it's called. It's fairly new, actually. They do have
Sentinel,
like,
perhaps we got from James.
Yeah, that sounds right. They do have like firewall, like I guess they're more like WAF type solutions, but they do a sort of similar thing around. I mean, obviously WAF is web application firewall, but you know, they have some of those, I guess, functions to be able to, and the network security gateway, which is in Azure, have the ability to, you know, do those sorts of you know, anomaly detections and things like that. So there is some things available in there. Otherwise, you can always deploy something like Snort into those environments, because then what you're doing is you're just sort of sniffing the network traffic within your VPC, so your virtual private sort of little network there. So, and I think things like, you know, AWS and Azure have their marketplaces where, you know, you can, you know, companies have pre-built those sort of images that you can just spin them up and configure them and get running. So
from the perspective of getting a unified view of those environments as well, I've found things like Sentinel or anything in Azure generally, as well as GuardDuty in AWS and their VPC flow logs as well. They provide great APIs to get those logs out of your SIEM too, so you don't lose that sort of unified view and that whole view you can end up with. They integrate really well.
Except for the time I went to 300 gig a day of logs.
I don't mind when that happens.
That did happen.
Alrighty, just a couple questions left, and thanks both of you for your generosity with your time. And I'm sorry to those people whose questions I've dismissed. Just, you know, we can't get to all of them. There's what, 400 of you out there who have been listening, and I guess that, yeah, the advantage of the paid subjects, George, is you get to spend a bit more time in answering individual people's questions. But last couple questions, full of acronyms, as you might expect. How to update an IOC list or indicator of compromise, open source or paid source? From Peter?
Yeah. So this is interesting. I think for anything, there's going to be arguments for both.
I've had the sort of conversations around things like this, or things around threat intel, and do you pay the threat intel, and then is it just something that's is it really threat intel, or is it just something that's kind of like rebadged and so forth? Generally speaking, look, I'm probably not going to swing one way or the other. Obviously, there's merits in having a large organization that focuses on maintaining these types of lists, but yeah, you're going to pay for it. I think it's really going to come down to two things, which is risk and budget. So how much money do you have to spend versus what is the risk of using a paid or a free. I mean, I often rely on a lot of sort of free sources, especially my own sort of research, because I'm not going to go out there and pay like a big sort of Mandiant or SecureWorks or for that sort of thing for my own sort of research. But there's obviously merit in those sorts of services, and so from a corporate perspective, I do pay for stuff, but I think it's almost you need a blend of both, because the threats are always evolving, and they're always changing, and it's useful to have as much intel as you can. So it's probably not a very clear answer to that question, but yeah, I'm not sure if there's entirely a right or wrong answer, but one almost complements the other.
I say just take a punt. Don't worry about it. Shannon Olson has asked a question, and it's not too specific, and maybe it is, but I don't care, because you've been very present in the forums, and I'm very grateful for it. Keep it up. Thanks a lot. Is the use of DNS becoming more or less prevalent for example, beaconing and command and control traffic? And how is DNS over HTTPS affecting this, if indeed it is?
Look, I think, I don't know the exact answer to that. My feel is that it probably is becoming less prevalent. Organizations now are starting to shift away from just allowing all outbound. So in other words, whatever port you want, out you go from every single workstation. I've seen many CNC demos where, you're beaconing out to things like Twitter. And the way it works is it beacons out to Twitter, and when it sees a particular tweet, that's kind of it's kind of switched to go, oh, all right, now I should go do something. And then it receives instructions from that. And then obviously, as I talked about before, with things like SSL decrypt or lack thereof, it makes it a lot harder to inspect the traffic. So I think that, well, my opinion is that there is a shift towards that and towards using, public platforms that are out there just because the traffic looks less suspicious, which does make our jobs a lot harder. So that's, I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, I think that's a good question, and I think that's where it's going. And I think that's probably where it's going to.
Any thoughts, Matt?
Not on that. I think George covered it. I am seeing DNS being used frequently in the wild. I mentioned during the demo that Sophos takes very heavy advantage of it. And when I said 9 times out of 10, when I'm looking for unusual DNS traffic, it is a Sophos device. It's probably more like 99 times out of 100, to be perfectly honest. But it is still out there. I couldn't comment on it being used over HTTPS, though.
A funny story about a Sophos device. A Sophos firewall was blocking the endpoint protection from doing its updates.
Okay.
As in, Sophos endpoint was being blocked by a Sophos. It drove me bonkers for hours, and then it turned out it was that, and it was like, you are kidding me, right? So, yeah, that was a bit painful. I see another question there about the shirt at DEF CON. So the key there is just don't turn your devices on when you're at DEF CON. Problem solved. Put it in a Faraday bag or Faraday cage and leave it in your room off. There's that. So, yeah, everyone's warned.
Beauty. All right. Well, thanks everyone for hanging around. Matt, it's lovely to meet you. Thanks for joining in. That was really useful and great idea, George, to bring someone in. Really excellent session. What are we going to chat about next week? Future of cybersecurity, I think. Is that
Yeah,
the plan?
So we're gonna do a little bit of a recap of the last few weeks. We'll talk about the future and where things are going. And so yeah, maybe prepare some questions. Not
Great.
too hard though.
Nah, beauty. All right. Well, thanks everyone for hanging around. Thanks Rebecca and Hannah for everything as always. And yeah, thanks for Matt for joining us and George for making this course happen.
Yeah, and I do see some other really good questions in there. So yeah, pop those up there to the forums so we can answer them.
Beauty.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's been good fun.
Yeah,
Great.
thanks again, man.
Oh, come anytime.
Right. Thanks everyone for coming.